Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Micklus, and I'm a principal analyst with Informa. And our next discussion will focus on innovation in deal-making, looking at deal-making trends and examples of novel transactions by the top 20 pharmaceutical companies across 5 key therapy areas. By way of our agenda for this afternoon, we'll first begin with a look at some top-level deal-making trends across 5 key therapy areas over a 10-year time period. From there, we'll drill down a little deeper into each of those therapy areas and look at some trends and some interesting examples and case studies for where the top 20 pharmaceutical companies have really been innovating in their deal-making. Following on that, we'll review what is the impact of that externalization on company revenue, and then we'll close out with some conclusions. For this particular analysis, these are the top 20 pharmaceutical companies that were included, and this is based off of our Script 100 survey, which ranks global pharmaceutical companies by revenue size. And the therapy areas that were included in the analysis were diabetes, neurology and pain, autoimmune disease, and oncology. And these represent areas where many large pharmaceutical companies realize large proportions of their revenue. And as Ian just showed in his presentation, they also include many of the top indications right now in research and development. They also provide a nice cross-section of deal-making, ranging from areas such as oncology and neurology, which are very active in deal-making in terms of volume, compared with areas such as diabetes or autoimmune disease, where the deal-making volume is comparably smaller, but these areas represent very commercially lucrative markets. As I said, this analysis covers a 10-year time period, and for many of the data and the trends, the 10-year time period was split into 2 5-year time periods, from 2008 to 2012 and 2013 to 2017. So let's start with a look at some top-level deal trends, first starting with deal volume. And the bottom left-hand figure shows those 5 therapy areas with that split in the 10-year time period. And the bottom right-hand figure shows the same data, but just on a year-over-year basis. And what initially is striking is that oncology remains a major focus for this group of top 20 pharmaceutical companies. And deal-making has especially intensified within the last 5 years. There's also been a notable increase in the volume of autoimmune disease deals within the last 5 years, although it's slightly difficult to see because of the range in the y-axis. And this has become a big focus area for the existing leaders in the autoimmune disease market, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In addition to looking at deal volume, it's also helpful to look at how average value metrics have changed over time. And both the upfront and total deal value averages have generally grown in the most recent 5 years. Across all of these therapy areas, upfront averages have grown in the most recent time period, with the exception of diabetes, which experienced a slight decrease in the average upfront. Although it's interesting to note that in the first 5-year time period, average upfront payments on diabetes deals were the highest among these therapy areas. Now, this average was largely increased by one outlier deal, which was AstraZeneca's alliance with Bristol Myers Squibb in 2012, in which it received a 50% stake in the amylin business, with, of course, AstraZeneca going on to buy the entirety of Bristol Myers Squibb's diabetes business in 2013. Upfront averages on both autoimmune disease deals as well as pain deals have also been significantly higher in the last 5 years. And this was really driven by several large agreements, several big money agreements signed around novel mechanisms of action to address both of these conditions. And we'll also talk about that a little more later. Total deal value averages are also generally trending upward in the most recent 5 years, particularly in oncology, diabetes, and pain. Now that we've looked at some top-level deal-making metrics, let's take a closer look at each of these therapy areas. First, starting with diabetes. And for each of these therapy areas, what I've tried to do is to draw out some interesting case studies and examples of how the top 20 pharmaceutical companies have really been innovating in their deal-making, and also give an indication as to where their future deal-making may be focused. And within diabetes deal-making, we see these companies innovating in terms of diabetes management and establishing alliances involving novel technologies to not only improve disease monitoring, but also to improve health outcomes. This figure here shows the most active company in-licensors in the diabetes market over the past 10 years. And you'll see that Sanofi is ranked at the top as the most active in terms of in-licensing deal volume. And Sanofi has done a couple of interesting deals around this area of diabetes management. It's established an alliance with a company called Voluntis to develop a mobile phone application. And it has also set up a joint venture with Verily, which is formerly known as Google Life Sciences, to integrate treatment and monitoring solutions for diabetes patients. And there are several other interesting examples by the key leaders in the diabetes market who have done interesting deals around the idea of disease management. For instance, there are several deals that Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk have done. Notably, in 2017, Roche did a bolt-on acquisition in the diabetes market and acquired a company called MySugar, which offers patient-centered digital health services as well as offers mobile phone applications for diabetes. So what we're seeing here in the diabetes deal-making market is reflective of an overall trend in the industry to move toward more digital health applications. And particularly within diabetes, we see the top companies in this market are able to realize value from some of their existing products. One potential future focus of diabetes deal-making may center around stratifying patients for more targeted treatment. The current way that diabetes is classified is into these two main branches of type 1 and type 2. And this classification has been used for many, many years. But if drug developers wish to segment out the patient populations in a more targeted way, specifically type 2 diabetes, genomics analysis is not an ideal solution. There are over 100 genes that make a patient susceptible to diabetes, and the heterogeneity of the disease doesn't stem from a single genetic linkage. So genomics analysis, the way that it is used, for example, in oncology care to segment out patients, isn't an ideal fit for the diabetes market. So for instance, Novo Nordisk has established some collaborations with academic research institutions to study the viability of dissecting the heterogeneity of type 2 diabetes, and they've come up with some interesting results. They've identified what they call 5 replicable clusters of diabetes patients who have significantly different patient characteristics and risks for diabetes complications. And they believe that this may be a superior method for predicting disease progression in diabetes. So moving forward, we may see more companies in the top 20 pharma group who are focused on diabetes establish alliances, not only with academic research institutions, but also with technology companies who have these capabilities. And now we'll take a closer look at deal-making in neurology and pain. And I've grouped these two together because the top 20 pharma companies have done a good job at realizing value through out-licensing their assets. And we can think about the neuroscience area right now as sort of a therapeutic white space. There have been many large pharmaceutical companies that have backed away from neuroscience research or deprioritized neuroscience research. For instance, Pfizer has recently announced that it is doing this. And while there are many indications in the central nervous system area or CNS area that are well served and have lots of treatment options for patients, such as multiple sclerosis, there are still many CNS indications that have a high unmet medical need, namely in Alzheimer's disease. And to put this into perspective, there were only 12 drugs, CNS drugs, approved by the FDA between 2012 and 2016. And this was a decrease from the 19 drugs the FDA approved in the previous 5 years. In contrast, the FDA approved 50 new oncology drugs between 2012 and 2016, and this was more than double the number of drugs that they had approved in the prior 5 years. And even further, the CNS area, including psychiatric indications as well as pain, was the only major therapy area to experience a decrease in the number of FDA approvals between 2012 and 2016. Now, in 2017, the FDA approved a total of 6 new CNS drugs, and that was in one single year. So what we're seeing is that while large pharmaceutical companies, many of them have been backing away from neuroscience research, we have smaller biotech companies and smaller specialty pharmaceutical companies that are picking up that work and advancing drug candidates. So where has deal-making in the neurology area been concentrated over the past 10 years? If we look at deal-making activity by the indication of the drug that's being licensed, you can see that pain and Alzheimer's disease remain big focus areas for this top 20 peer set. And pain is ranked at the top in terms of volume of in-licensing deals done. But you'll notice that the deal-making activity has actually slowed down a bit in the most recent 5 years. Nevertheless, there have been many agreements signed around novel mechanisms of action to address pain conditions. For instance, there's been a renewed interest in the anti-nerve growth factor antibody class, including big money deals signed by Pfizer and Eli Lilly, as well as Teva and Regeneron. And in particular, this brand new potential market for migraine prevention has also led to a large number of big deals being signed, particularly around the calcitonin gene-related peptide or CGRP inhibitor class of antibodies. Activity in Alzheimer's disease has actually maintained quite a steady focus over the past 10 years, despite the number of clinical trial failures that we have seen, that some of which have trickled down and led to the termination of deals. But despite these failures, there are several active partnerships that involve top 20 pharmaceutical companies, and I've listed some of those here, including the targets that they are evaluating. In addition, psychiatric indications remain quite active indications in neurological deal-making, particularly depression and schizophrenia. As I mentioned, out-licensing in the neurology area can bring about a lot of value. And according to a wider survey that we did on overall CNS deal-making, what we found was that big pharma companies have not been as active as other peer set groups of companies, such as mid-sized pharma companies or smaller specialty pharma companies, in terms of in-licensing their CNS assets. But rather, big pharma companies were more inclined to out-license or sell their CNS assets. And you can see that here if we break down the activity in neurology deal-making over the past 10 years between in-licensing and out-licensing. In-licensing and out-licensing, that out-licensing has really kept up a steady pace year over year. And we can look at some interesting examples of out-licensing transactions, both in the broader neurology area as well as specifically in pain. These companies here have been the most active in terms of out-licensing neurology assets over this 10-year time period. And you can see Eli Lilly is ranked at the top in terms of volume. And Eli Lilly in particular has been very active in out-licensing and has done a couple of interesting deal structures that have involved a buyback option in the migraine market. Eli Lilly developed 2 different migraine drugs against 2 different targets, 5-HT1F and CGRP. And Eli Lilly partnered these drugs with 2 different companies, CoLucid and Arteis. And after these companies further developed these drugs and by extension somewhat de-risked them, Eli Lilly ended up bringing these drugs back into its portfolio. There have also been some examples of where CNS assets have gone full circle within the top 20 pharma group of companies, moving from one top 20 company to another. And one interesting example is also in the migraine market, the CGRP inhibitor formanzanumab, which was originally developed by Pfizer. Pfizer licensed this drug to a small biotech called Labris Biologics. And in 2014, Teva acquired Labris and now potentially has one of the leading molecules in this completely new market for migraine prevention. Although just recently there was an announcement about Teva's manufacturing partner, Celltrion, which could possibly delay that drug a bit. There are many, many other interesting examples of out-licensing in the neurology area over the past 10 years. And I've only listed a few here. There are several others. But I wanted to point out the last one on the list, which is GlaxoSmithKline and Axovant. And this involved the 5-HT6 antagonist in Interpridine. Just recently, at the end of last year, Axovant announced that Interpridine failed in phase 3 Alzheimer's disease trials. And it's also announced that it is no longer developing this drug for Lewy body dementia, which could have potentially been a follow-on indication. Now, Axovant got this drug from GlaxoSmithKline for $5 million up front. And $5 million is not a lot of money for a large pharmaceutical company. But it was still $5 million that GlaxoSmithKline got for a drug that it had deprioritized and no longer saw any value in. So I think it's an example of smart out-licensing on GlaxoSmithKline's part. And now we'll take a look at autoimmune disease deal making. And this is a smaller deals market in terms of the volume compared with some of the other therapy areas. But it's very focused around expanding the drug classes used in order to compete with the standard of care, including biosimilars, which are really dominated right now by the anti-tumor necrosis factor or anti-TNF class of drugs. And companies within the top 20 pharmaceutical peer set are evaluating not only novel autoimmune disease targets, but completely new drug classes through both partnerships as well as bolt-on acquisitions. And we can look at some of these targets and classes. For instance, both Eli Lilly and Incyte, as well as Gilead and Galapagos, have had very successful collaborations developing JAK inhibitors for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis as well as autoimmune diseases. Eli Lilly and Incyte have developed baricitinib, which is approved in the European Union and awaiting approval in the US. And Gilead and Galapagos have developed filgotinib. just recently, Johnson & Johnson and Theravance also signed an agreement around JAK inhibitors in autoimmune diseases as well. There are many top 20 pharmaceutical companies also involved in deals that are studying different classes of interleukin inhibitors for autoimmune diseases. In addition, there's been a lot of interest around modulating immune system tolerance, and there are several different pathways that are the subject of many deals. Notably, in 2016, Bristol-Myers Squibb did a bolt-on acquisition in this area and bought a company called Padlock Therapeutics, which is developing protein peptidyl arginine deaminase inhibitors that clear out autoantigens that are believed to lead to autoimmune diseases. Johnson & Johnson's Janssen and Ionis Pharmaceuticals are both looking at the entire class of antisense oligonucleotides in order to see if they're effective in treating autoimmune diseases of the gastrointestinal tract. And a couple of other interesting targets involved in autoimmune disease deal making are ROR gamma T and liver X receptor. Allergan also did a bolt-on acquisition in 2016 and acquired Vitae Pharmaceuticals, which is developing drugs against both of these targets. And Johnson & Johnson and Phoenix have an alliance just focused on ROR gamma T. In autoimmune disease deal making, what we're seeing is a lot of portfolio management going on by the existing leaders in that market to help extend that leadership. And if we look at the top companies in terms of in-licensing volume over the past 10 years, we see the top companies are Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer. And both of these companies are already leaders in the autoimmune disease market. Johnson & Johnson, for example, has Remicade, Simponi, and Stelara. And Pfizer has Enbrel, Xeljanz, and its own biosimilar, Inflectra, a biosimilar to infliximab. So we're seeing these companies looking to extend that leadership position through their deal making. In our final therapy area, we'll take a closer look at oncology deal making. And what we're seeing here are genomics technologies, targeted therapy, and immuno-oncology converging. And if we first start with a look at bolt-on acquisition activity in immuno-oncology, what we see here are the themes of precision medicine and immuno-oncology reflected in some of the most important deals. Over the past 10 years, there's been quite a drastic increase in not only the volume of oncology bolt-on acquisitions done, but also the value attributed to those deals. And these here represent the most acquisitive from the top 20 pharmaceutical peer set in terms of oncology bolt-on acquisitions. And Roche has clearly been a leader in terms of the volume of acquisitions done and has shown a very clear focus on precision medicine, really building off the expertise and the success that it has had in the molecular diagnostics market. For instance, Roche acquired the majority ownership in Foundation Medicine, which is a tumor genomics analysis profiling company. And at the end of last year, it bought Ignyta, which is taking a tissue agnostic approach to the treatment of cancer. And just last week, Roche announced another bolt-on acquisition and bought a company called Flatiron Health, which has software capabilities to mine electronic health records with potential use in precision medicine. On the immuno-oncology side, we've seen several big deals that have brought important immuno-oncology products into the portfolios of their acquirers. Notably, in late 2017, Gilead acquired Kite Pharma and its approved CAR T therapy, Yescarta. And this deal now allows Gilead to build out an entire cell therapy platform built around Yescarta as well as future CAR T therapies. In addition to looking at bolt-on M&A activity on oncology, we can also look at partnership or alliance activity. And there has been dramatic growth in the volume of deals signed by this group of top 20 companies. Over the past 10 years, you can see that dramatic growth in volume. And to put it into perspective, this group of companies signed approximately 36 in-licensing deals in the oncology area in 2008. And that has exactly tripled to well over 100 by 2017. We can also look at average deal value metrics in oncology. And the total deal value average fluctuates quite a bit. And this is namely because of the large volume of deals that are signed in oncology and the wide range in values that are attributed to those deals. But if we look at the average upfronts on oncology deals, those have also experienced a threefold increase, going from an average of $83 million in 2008 to well over $200 million by 2017. Now, the 2017 average was largely increased by one outlier deal, which was AstraZeneca's partnership with Merck & Co. for the development of Lynparza, as well as the development of combinations. In addition to seeing themes of precision medicine and immuno-oncology reflected on bolt-on acquisitions, we also see these represented in alliances or partnerships. And precision medicine has remained a steady component in overall oncology deal-making over the past 10 years. And this is going to continue to be important as precision medicine and immuno-oncology are integrated. Immuno-oncology activity in particular has really intensified within the most recent 5 years. And as a proportion of all oncology alliances signed, the share of immuno-oncology has increased from 12% in the first 5-year time period to 37%. And this proportion is likely a lot larger due to the increase in the number of clinical trial collaborations that have been signed around the development of combination therapies in immuno-oncology. Another interesting trend in the immuno-oncology market is that early stage deal making is really now the focus. And if we break out that deal making activity by the phase of the drug that was licensed, within the last 5 years, deals that were signed for preclinical or phase 1 drugs accounted for more than half, or 58% of the total deal volume done. And this was an increase from the 44% proportion in the first 5 years, which itself was a pretty large proportion. So it's just showing that the top 20 pharmaceutical companies are really accessing innovation in the oncology area at the early stages. And the most active oncology in-licensors have a strategic focus in immuno-oncology. And if we look at the top companies by in-licensing activity, what we see is that AstraZeneca has been the lead in-licenser in aggregate over this 10-year time period. But in the most recent 5 years, Merck & Co. has been more active and has really built off the momentum and the success that it has had with Keytruda. Alongside AstraZeneca and Merck, Bristol Myers Squibb, as well as Roche, are also quite active. So you can see here these top 4 companies are really the strong leaders right now in the immuno-oncology market. On the flip side, Teva and Bayer have slowed down their deal-making in oncology. And for Teva, this is not very surprising given the uncertainty and the restructuring that the company has been undergoing, as well as the fact that it has announced that it is planning to sell its European oncology business. But for Bayer, this does not represent a deprioritization in oncology. In fact, it's quite the opposite, and Bayer has stated its intention to continue to participate in the oncology market and be a leader, and has also established a dedicated business unit around oncology. lastly, I wanted to point out GlaxoSmithKline here because it is ranked pretty high in this in-licensors list. And even with the asset swap that it did in 2014, in which it sold its oncology business to Novartis, GlaxoSmithKline is still very much active in oncology and retained certain oncology programs from that asset swap. And just recently, its new CEO, Emma Walmsley, has announced that oncology is one of the 4 therapy areas that the company will be focusing its research and development on. And GlaxoSmithKline has stated that within oncology, its focus areas are immuno-oncology, including cell therapies, as well as cancer epigenetics. Looking forward, we potentially may see more collaborations between these top 20 pharmaceutical companies and firms involved in big data technologies, whether they are artificial intelligence, machine learning, or predictive modeling. And the question is this going to continue to be a trend, or is this a little bit of hype right now? And I wanted to put up a couple of quotes from some key industry executives and analysts who are touting the strong potential of these types of artificial intelligence technologies. And the top 20 pharma companies have already gotten involved. This is just a select example of collaborations between big pharma companies and big data companies, specifically in the oncology area. For instance, both Novartis and Pfizer have both teamed up with IBM's Watson Health, and Roche has also been quite active in this area, including that recent acquisition of Flatiron Health. So there's lots of potential that exists with artificial intelligence technologies to be able to mine these large sets of data in order to make sense of them and to improve drug development and design, as well as predict patient outcomes and ultimately improve R&D productivity. And while I think it is still very early stages for this type of technology, I do foresee this continuance of large pharmaceutical companies teaming up with big data companies to test out these technologies. So now that we've looked at some top-level deal-making trends and drilled a little deeper into each of those therapy areas, I wanted to conclude with a look at what is the impact of that externalization? What is the impact of that deal-making on company revenue? So why is externalization important? Well, very simply, your revenue depends on it. If we look at the combined top 20 pharma peer set for these 5 therapy areas combined, going back to 2002 and forecasted out through 2026, and breaking out that revenue by products that were developed internally versus those that were developed externally, whether it was through an in-licensing agreement, a co-development deal, or an acquisition, what you see is that the revenue for externalized products is expected to grow at more than twice the rate as that of internally developed drugs. And even further, if we look at the average per drug revenue over 3 5-year time periods, it's expected to be higher for those externalized products. Now again, this is for those top 5 therapy areas combined. If you break out the data into the individual therapy areas, this same trend actually holds true, except for one, which is diabetes. And in diabetes, what we see are internally developed drugs driving revenue more so than externalization. And these 2 figures here are the same exact figures from the previous slide, but just for the diabetes market. And you can see that internally developed drugs are forecasted to grow at a much faster rate with a much higher average per drug revenue. And this is mainly the result of several internally developed drugs by some of the key leaders in the diabetes market: Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Merck & Co., and Sanofi, which have each developed and produced very commercially successful diabetes products. And now we can go over some of the key takeaways from innovative deal making by the top 20 pharmaceutical companies. Starting first with diabetes. And what we saw here was that the top 20 pharma peer set have really been innovating, not so much in signing deals around novel mechanisms of action or new ways to treat diabetes, although deal making in that area is going on. But rather, these companies have established alliances involving novel technologies to monitor and manage the disease. In both neurology and pain, the top 20 pharma peer set has done a good job at capturing value through out-licensing their CNS assets. The autoimmune disease deal-making market is characterized by new mechanisms of action that will broaden the market and offer patients more options and improved options over the standard of care, including biosimilars. And in oncology, we found that immuno-oncology, precision medicine, and the combination of those are driving future deal making. And finally, externalization through both alliances as well as bolt-on M&As is very critical to driving revenue. Thank you very much for your attention, and I can take some questions.